So the Civil War gave birth to naturalism and realism because of the huge amount of people who died, the invention of photography, where people actually saw photos of the dead, of the Civil War dead, for the very first time. And this inaugurated the literary movement of naturalism and realism. After World War I, and people saw the returning veterans were disillusioned with American way of life, and there was an industrial revolution at the same time, huge growth and migration of people from Europe, as well as migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And so that gave birth to, in other words, the World War I gave birth to modernism, in which technology is seen as a good thing. And now we're getting into 1945 to the present, the after effects of World War II. And so the after effects of World War II gave birth to postmodernism. So each of the wars left a scar on the American psyche and on the American literary scene. Since the end of the Second World War to the present day, the people of the United States have witnessed the incredible economic, technological growth of their nation into a global, cultural, and military superpower. These years of growth also have been times of radical cultural transformation, during which the nation reassessed its traditions. America, in the post-World War II period, lived through times of peace and war, decades of cultural conformity, and decades of social revolt. For the first 2 decades of this period, Americans lived in a racially segregated nation. They now live in a multicultural nation that has twice elected a black president. For much of this period, Americans lived in a world of ideologically warring superpowers poised on the brink of nuclear annihilation. So what differentiates World War I from the previous wars, it seems as if with every war, the military weapons become more and more advanced. In the Civil War, I think it was the invention of a more advanced kind of rifle that could shoot accurately someone in the chest. And during World War I, it was the invention of mustard nerve gas, as well as airplanes that saw tremendous casualties. And then World War II comes along, and it's the invention of the nuclear war. So you see that with each war, there's more and more potential for destruction and death. And as a result, people started to question, is all of this science and technology really any good? How does creating a nuclear bomb, how does that lead to progress? I mean, the human race has now figured out a way to eliminate itself, from the entire planet. And so this puts into question the whole question of the Enlightenment, whether or not technology really good for humankind, or are we just destined to destroy ourselves? And is life really worth it? Is life meaningless? During the modernist era, it was about looking at art. In other words, art is a perception of reality. Reality is a perception of art. And we look at art and we perceive our reality that way. But with postmodernism, it's all about who we are, our existence, our cultural identity, existentialism, our existence, the importance of our existence. And this comes into play during during the civil rights, when black is beautiful. Therefore, then suddenly all of the voices that were not heard in literature before, like Native American more African American literature, people who live on, and people who are gay, all kinds of people that, who were not seen in American literature a lot before, now come to the forefront towards the end of the 20th century. So getting back to this, so Americans lived in a world of ideologically warring superpowers poised on the brink of nuclear annihilation. They now live in a world intimately connected by massive computer networks and a complex global economy, yet one still riven by dangerous religious and economic disputes. In popular culture, Americans' taste in music have moved from jazz and rock and roll to hip-hop and electronic music. In the visual arts, Americans have seen explosive canvases of abstract expressionists such as Jackson Pollock become the Campbell Soup cans of pop artists such as Andy Warhol, and then the video screens of cable TVs, MTV, and now multimedia artists on YouTube. And I would also could add TikTok to make it more, it's not just YouTube, it's also TikTok. Their art and entertainment have come to them increasingly through technology, starting with film and radio, then television, and now the internet. In the literature of this amazing transformative era, we find a record of how the nation has known, questioned, and even redefined itself. When the United States ended the Second World War by dropping the atomic bomb on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nation was well positioned to assume a role of global leadership. While the cities and factories of both its enemies, Germany and Japan, and its allies, Britain and Soviet Union, were destroyed in the war, the continental U.S. was never attacked. The American industries that won the war quickly retooled to win the peace, selling cars, radios, and washing machines within an increasingly global economy and ushering in an era of unparalleled American prosperity. The U.S. government spent tens of billions of dollars in foreign aid to rebuild former enemies, Germany and Japan, ensuring that they would be both economic and military allies in the future. The GI Bill paid for an unprecedented number of American men to attend colleges and buy homes, creating a huge professional middle class eager to work for the nation's high-tech corporations and live in growing new suburbs. The decade and a half following the Second World War is often called the Age of Conformity, that as the nation's large college-educated middle class embraced the values of the nuclear family and sought happiness after years of desperate war in their society's newfound abundance of consumer goods. So think the 1950s, think Happy Days. If you want to watch television, it was Happy Days. Yet the peace was short-lived, and there was dissent at home. In the midst of the post-war era of prosperity, Allen Ginsberg composed his great poem Howl, in which he lambasted the nation's conformist culture for destroying its best and brightest citizens. Authors of the Beat movement of the 1950s, such as Ginsberg, celebrated America's counterculture and sought to free literature from formalism and align it more closely with improvisatory musical solos of jazz and the spontaneous drips and splashes of abstract expressionist action painting and the everyday utterances of the American street. Storytellers of the second wave of Southern Renaissance resisted America's culture of conformity and embraced their distinct regionality, with Georgia author Flannery O'Connor lamenting in her essay The Fiction Writer and His Country, and that the traditional South was getting more and more like the rest of the materialistic, money-hungry country. Poets during this period, such as Theodore Rokie and Sylvia Plath, began sharing intimate, sometimes disturbing details from their life in a newly confessional mode of poetry that showed how the nuclear family could be a source of stress as well as stability, ultimately showing the nation how the personal situation of the writer could represent the politics of the nation as a whole. On the world stage, the Soviet Union organized the East European nations that it had conquered during World War II into a political bloc dedicated to Russian-led socialism, under which the state owns all businesses and administers all social services, as opposed to American-led free market capitalism, under which private individuals own all businesses. The former allies found themselves competing for the hearts and minds of the world over the value of their respective social systems. When the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, the U.S. and the Soviet Union entered into a conflict called the Cold War. The two enemies proceeded to build tens of thousands of nuclear weapons over the following decades to deter each from attacking the other, accumulating enough atomic bombs to destroy human civilization many times over. The U.S. committed itself to a policy of Soviet containment, checking the influence of so-called Red Menace abroad through foreign aid and limited military action, and prosecuting American artists and activists with leftist sympathies at home through such venues as the House Un-American Activities Committee. Some of the authors in this chapter had their careers curtailed during this fearful time because of their political beliefs, as when poet William Carlos Williams was stripped of his consultancy to the Library of Congress in 1952 for having written a poem titled Russia. In addition to grappling with the threats of nuclear war and the Red Menace, Americans at this time were also grappling with the homegrown injustice of racial segregation. Up until 1965, Americans in many states lived under Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised African Americans, keeping black citizens socially separate from and legally inferior to white citizens. And so during the time of Jim Crow, if you're black, you would go into the bathroom marked for colored only. And if you're white, you go into the bathroom marked for whites only. If you're black, you go to the restaurant that says everything was separated. So everyone had separate restaurants, restrooms, even water fountains. Everything was separate, and that includes separate schooling, separate school districts in which black children went to school in black schools, white children went to school in white schools. And so segregation was based on the premise of separate but equal, which it didn't work out in the end. So up until 1965, Americans in many states lived under Jim Crow laws. I'll read this again. Okay. Up until 1965, so many people lived under Jim Crow laws which were unfair to African Americans. However, the civil rights and Black Power movement of the 1950s and 60s, led by Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, increasingly showed the nation that the experience of its prosperous, college-educated white middle class was not the experience of all Americans. The often violent struggle to desegregate America was televised across the nation, unifying the country within a new television culture in the very act of displaying its deep ideological divisions. The works in this chapter by Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and Ralph Ellison present a good record of what life was like in segregated America and during the civil rights movement. I remember watching television shows about this division. For instance, All in the Family, in which you had Carol O'Connor and Gene Stapleton. they played the older generation, World War II generation, the culture of conformity, as it were. They were the generation that fought World War II and then had the GI Bill, although Archie Bunker, that's the character, did not go to college. But anyway, and then the children, that would be the baby boomers, who were born from 1945 to 1964, and so then their children represented the hippie generation, the counterculture, who said, oh, well, not everybody was so comfortable, and you guys were so racist towards to African. So you got to see all in the family to get a good glimpse of what life was like from around the post-World War II era. In 1963, American President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. In 1974, another American president, Richard M. Nixon, resigned from the office in disgrace. The tumultuous decade in between these two events is known as the 60s. During this decade, America was fighting a seemingly endless war of containment in Vietnam. Students on college campuses protested the war and the policies of their own government. Urban populations rioted against racism and economic disparity. Artists and intellectuals radically reassessed America's prosperous post-war era as a culture of one-dimensional organizational men trapped in skyscrapers and servile women trapped by what so basically what they're saying is, so during the civil rights, ethnic minorities like African Americans wanted equal rights. Then women who worked at home, well, they wanted equal rights because they got tired of just being relegated to the house, and then if they tried to go to work, only men would get promoted. Women were paid less for the same work, and they were often not promoted. And women could only work as if they're not married. So married women were given more like prestige, but if you're an unmarried woman, you're a spinster. So only spinsters were allowed in women to go to work. And so the beginning of the feminine movement, where women wanted equal rights. So that's from the Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem were in the 60s. They launched a wave of feminist activity where they said that women want equal rights. So basically during this time period, everybody wanted equal rights. Okay, old people wanted to be treated with respect. Young people were against the conformist society because they saw the injustices, and so on and so forth. And so poets such as Adrienne Rich embodied the radical politics of this era, composing feminist poems such as the one included in this chapter. America returned to Cold War culture of conformity in the decade preceding the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So basically, they're talking about the 70s and the 80s in these last two paragraphs. Yet the changes the 60s had wrought in the nation's culture were permanent. From the time of the Civil Rights Movement to the present day, American writers have increasingly come to see the U.S. as being home to several kinds of Americans. And this is the birth of multiculturalism. In other words, multiculturalism literature, in which Americans of different kinds of, not just simply white male Americans, but female Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, straight Americans, queer Americans, each with their own unique experience started writing stories about their unique experience of life in America. The civil rights and feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s were followed by the gay rights and multicultural movements of the 1980s, 90s, and early 21st century. Western culture itself became more welcoming of a difference of other cultures after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, as the nations of Europe cast aside millennia of disagreements and joined in a European Union sharing a common currency, the euro. While the terrorists while the terrorist attack on September 11th illustrated how economically and technologically connected the world had become, it also illustrated how socially and ideologically divided we remain in the early 21st century. America's growing multicultural sensibility and tolerance of diversity has been both empowering and challenging, reflecting new kinds of political identity that often conflict with an American sense of who they are. Beholding the diversity within America, authors of the 1960s once worried about the death of the novel. It no longer felt possible for a single story to represent an American experience as a whole. Back in 1949, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman could stand up on stage as an American everyman dreaming the American dream. Yet Willie's life is far from representing every life in America, starting with the lives of every American woman and extending to every member of an American minority. American authors of the following decades began to represent America multiculturally as a nation of indigenous people and immigrants from other lands. The short stories by Alice Walker and Leslie Marmon Silko are good examples of multicultural literature. Silko draws specifically on her Native American heritage, while Alice Walker shows us the tensions that arise as her characters negotiate an identity that is grounded in both Africa and America. So that's the story Everyday Use. That was in your week 3, in which Dee goes to college and Dee participates in the Black is Beautiful, and she then, Dee that is one daughter, and she goes to college and she falls in love with an African boyfriend. Then the other daughter does not go to college and stays home. And so you got one daughter, and then when both daughters come together, you see the contrast between the college-educated, Black is Beautiful daughter who's engaged to her African, she even changed her name to Watango or something like that. And then you've got the other daughter who stayed home, and of course the narrator had more sympathies for the one who stayed home. But that shows you the tensions between, in African American. Are you more African or are you American? And what exactly is American? Hence, with postmodernism, it's more about who you are, your identity. What is that identity? For an Asian American are you Asian? You're going to follow Asian values or American values so Asian values obedience to elders, while American values independence of so it's that dichotomy of who are we as Americans that become present in the postmodernist era. The changes that the nation has undergone since 1945 have been disorienting, a disorientation that is reflected in Donald Bartholomew's story, also found in this chapter, The School, in which the reader struggles to make sense of all the odd and terrible things that happen in Bartholomew's average American school. The United States has remained an economic and cultural global superpower since 1945, but the politics of both the nation and the world during this time have been rapidly in flux, seeing the rise and fall of global empires, the emergence of new social justice movements, and the creation of a new sense of national identity. Science and technology, so important to winning the Second World War, have penetrated more and more parts of American society. The computer has been the most influential invention of the era, changing the way Americans both work and play. The media of the book, radio, and film have been joined by the new media of television and computer screen, giving Americans since 1945 an overwhelming variety of often contradictory ways to know themselves, their fellow citizens, and their world. So you get to, if you're on the internet, you could be, if you're conservative, you could read your conservative websites, and if you're liberal, you can read your liberal websites. And so nowadays, people have access to so many different points of view. So that brings into the question, Who are we as a nation? Can we unite together as one? With so many media in which we see, know, and communicate with one another, Americans in the final decades of the 20th century developed a growing sense of intertextuality of experience. That means that everything is interrelated and that one text relates to another text, such as one website to another website, as if all of experience is hyperlinked together. So the recognition that our lives are increasingly linked through computers, through electronic, like Facebook. So the recognition that our lives are increasingly lived through signs and images seen on life's many screens, that videos and computer simulations have become an indispensable part of American life and perhaps have taken the place of their reality. Now they're talking about virtual reality, and about how people can then escape into virtual reality, 3D, and into, I think there was a movie about that in which people could connect themselves to a computer and then they would go off and live another life inside the computer. So this sensibility is reflected in the transition from literary modernism to postmodernism during this period. You will read more about this later in this chapter. Postmodernist authors such as Bartholomew playfully use all the experimental literary techniques developed by the modernists in the first half of the century to represent many lives Americans live in the century's second half and beyond. The characters in Don DeLillo's 1985 postmodernist novel White Noise anticipates the 21st century obsession with social media as they realize that the many photographs of the most photographed barns in America are more real than the actual barn being photographed. David Foster Wallace's essay, Consider the Lobster, likewise represents the information overload Americans experience in the 21st century. His many footnotes creating a hyperlinked postmodern style of prose that reflects the superabundance of information available on the internet. So here we're starting to talk about the end of my PowerPoint, where I write about 21st century and the digital age, about how now we're coming to the present and how all of literature is now tied up with the internet, because you can blog, so you can self-publish your stories. You don't have to go to some publishing house to, like they used to do. And then you can have hyperlinked, you can have flash fiction, you can have cyber poetry, and you can have graphic novels. So those are all newer forms of 21st century literature that occurred with the advent of the internet and the computer. So American literature since 1945 has seen the rise of countercultural beats and the confessional poets. It contains the voices of radical feminists, conservative regionalists, and proud multiculturalists. It presides over the reinvention of America as its modernist storytellers of one American experience now stand beside the postmodernist storytellers of many American experiences. In all these ways and more, the American writers who lived through the extraordinary era since 1945 present us with an insightful record of what their nation and its people once were, of what they are, and what they may become. So I got all of these lectures from the book Writing the Nation, which is located in your Week 8 forum. So you can just click on that link or click on the book Writing the Nation, and then the link will create this PDF file that you see on all of these videos. And I read basically the introduction to all the chapters. And then inside the chapters are the actual stories or examples. For example, if I were to turn this page, and then suddenly you're going to have more about the authors. Okay, so here you're going to have more about Tennessee Williams and each author that was mentioned, James Dickey, Flannery O'Connor, and postmodernism. And so here, postmodernism is difficult to define. DeLillo is recognized as one of America's premier postmodernist novelists, yet he rejects the term entirely. So literally, the term postmodernism refers to the culture that comes after modernism, referring specifically to works created in the decades following the 1950s. The term's most precise definition comes from architecture, where it refers to a contemporary style of building that rejects the austerity and minimalism of modernist architecture, glass boxes, and towers. Postmodernist architects retain the functionalist core of the modernist building, but then decorate their boxes and towers with playful colors, forms, and ornaments that reference disparate historical eras. Indeed, play with media and materials and with form, styles, and content is one of the characteristics of postmodernist art. And one of the characteristics of postmodernist art is Andy Warhol, is the ability to make art accessible to everybody. And hence Andy Warhol's Campbell soup, by combining mass culture or popular culture into art. So while postmodernist architects play with the material of their buildings, postmodernist writers play with the material of their poems and their stories, namely the language and the book. Postmodernist writers freely use all the challenging experimental literary techniques developed by the modernists early in the 20th century, as well as even more experimental techniques of their own. In fiction, many postmodernist authors adopt a self-referential metafiction, a story that is just as much about the process of telling the story as it is about describing characters and events. What the hell is metafiction, you're asking me? Metafiction is, let's say you're writing a book. Normally when you read a book, the story flows from the triggering action to the climax and then resolution. And you don't even see the author. But in metafiction, the author will suddenly say, as you, the reader, as you read this story, in other words, he's going to point out the fact that the author is going to point out the fact that he's writing a story. So it becomes a story within a story. And that's kind of hard to understand unless you actually read one, you see. So this is something that you have to experience to understand metafiction. And so here's when The School. So Donald Bartholomew's postmodernist short story, The School, contains metafictional elements that comment. In other words, he comments on the process of storytelling. So right in the middle of Jane grabs the monster by the neck and then stop. And the narrator will go, and this was a difficult story for me to tell. Then back to, and Jane crushes the neck. So did you see that little aside where suddenly it's like, this was difficult for me to write? That's metafiction. It's when you stop in the middle of the action and comment on the story, on how hard it was to write or whatever, okay? So it's when you make comments. So the stories, it's a story within a story, that sort of thing. I can think of, and also flowing thoughts. You get to see the thoughts of the character as it flows, but not in any kind of logical order. In other words, for the first time, you see how thoughts are fragmented. That's another characteristic of postmodern fiction, is everything is written in fragments, like a collage, kind of like, and it's difficult to read. It's difficult to follow, and it's on purpose. Normally, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end to your story, but in a postmodernist novel, that's not the way it is. That's not the way it works. And what you read is a collage of experiences, and then the reader has to be interactive and try to figure out, what is he talking about? And so the reader is no longer just a passive consumer of literature. The reader becomes an active, more active, trying to figure out what is going to happen next, because the story is not written in order. So let's see. The School contains metafictional elements that comment on the process of storytelling and meaning making, as when the narrator describes how the lesson plan called for tropical fish input. even though all the students in the schoolroom knew that the fish would soon die. Who is telling this story? Bartholomew, the unnamed narrator, the lesson plan? The stories that make up history itself are often a playground for postmodernist authors as they take materials found in history books and weave it into new tales that reveal secret histories and dimly perceived conspiracies. David Foster essay, Consider the Lobster, is a good example of the narrative excess found in postmodern literature. In this essay, Wallace uses his visit to the Maine Lobster Festival to tell a history of the lobster since the Jurassic period that eventually turns against the organizers of the festival itself, who may or may not be covering up the truth about how much lobsters suffer in their cooking pots. And diving into the wreck, and the form of the essay cannot even contain Wallace's ideas, which spill over into 20 excessively long footnotes. In addition to playing with the form of literature and the notion of authorship, postmodernist writers often play with popular subgenres, such as the detective story, horror, and science fiction. For example, in her poem, Diving into the Wreck, Adrienne Rich evokes both the detective story and science fiction as she imagines a futuristic diver visiting a deep sea wreck in order to solve a mystery of why literature and history have been mostly about men and not women. Not all works of postmodern literature are experimental or playful. Rather, their authors explore the meaning and value of postmodernity as a cultural condition. Several philosophers and literary critics, many of whose names have become synonymous with postmodernism, have helped us understand what the postmodern condition may be. Post-structural philosophers such as Jacques Derrida and Jean Baudrillard have argued that words and text do not reflect the world, but instead exist as their own self-referential systems containing and even creating the world they describe. When we perceive the world, Derrida's philosophy of deconstruction claims we see not things, but signs that can be understood only through the relations to other signs. There is no outside text. In this way, words and books and texts are powerful things, for in them our world itself is created, an insight that many postmodernist creative writers share. Baudrillard, in turn, argues in his book that the real world has been filled up with even replaced by simulations that we now treat as reality. These postmodern sensibilities are reflected in in all of this in English. Postmodernism deals with the alienation of society, fragmentation of the American psyche, and earlier in American history, you could talk about one America, one American. And then now it's all in postmodern literature, everything is fragmented, everything has been pushed aside. In other words, it's just like when the nuclear bomb exploded and everything went into all these different pieces. And so basically, everything that you see, everything that you perceive is fragmented and divided. And words have power. And every culture is a different way of looking at the same thing. Asian Americans look at the world a certain way. African Americans look at the world a certain way. Hispanic Americans look at the world a certain way. There's no longer just one American way of looking at something. And so that's how America is not struggling to redefine herself as to who is she, where is she headed, how should she define her existence, and what is America, what are American values. So all of this questioning of one's identity goes back to that is a major factor in postmodern literature, trying to figure out who am I. So and all of this, so that I'm not going to read all of this, but And so when you read poetry from this time period, or anything, everything is a collage. So is America just a collage of different people from different ethnicities? Or should all the different ethnicities assimilate into mainstream America and just and ignore their heritage? Should we all just say we're all Americans and skip the hyphen? Instead of saying I'm Asian American, I simply should say I'm American. And so there are people on both sides of the issue who some argue, well, we want to keep our heritage. While others saying, well, if you keep your heritage, why don't you just go back to your country? Because here in America, we just want to be American, you see. So you got both sides arguing, and this creates division, kind of like being psychotic or schizophrenic in the American psyche. So the culture of postmodernism then exhibits a skepticism toward grand truth claims and unifying narratives that have organized culture since the time of the Enlightenment. In postmodern culture, history becomes a field of competing histories, and self becomes a hybrid being with multiple partial identities. Yes, partial identities. Are you Asian? Are you American? Are you African? Are you not? Or are you American? And what exactly, when you say American, why does that mean something different for every group? And so it becomes a hybrid being with multiple identities. So in his provocative study, The Postmodern Condition, the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard argues that what defines the present postmodern historical era is the collapse of grand narratives that explain all experiences, all faiths, and all truths, such as those found in science, politics, and religion. And in place of these all-explaining master narratives, we now know the world through smaller micro-narratives that don't all fit together into a great coherent whole. These insights are thoroughly explored in confessional, feminist, and multicultural American literature of this era, whose writers write from their subjective points of view rather than presuming to represent the sum total of all American experiences, and whose works show us that American history has been far from the same experience for all Americans. For example, both Sylvia Plath and Theodore Roque have poems about their fathers, but their appreciation of their respective fathers is shaped by both their gender and their own personal histories. Roque feels a kinship with his father. Plath, however, sees her father as an enemy. The Native American author of Leslie Marmon Silko tells her story specifically from the point of view of a member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe, whose members use old stories about the Yellow Woman and Kahuna Katsina spirit to understand their tribal relationship to the rest of America. In the works of African American literature, in this section, we find similar explorations of cultural identity. James Baldwin uses African American music of blues and jazz to describe the relationship between two brothers in his story, Sunny Blues. And just like in Alice Walker's story, Everyday Use, where you had one black character who was into the black is beautiful and Africa, and then the other one is just more traditional and living in rural black, and you don't necessarily, and living at her house and just being proud of who her family was, even if they were just slaves. And at least this is from Dee's point of view in the story. And then in Sunny's Blues, you have two black men. One is a school teacher and the other is a musician. And both of them have different points of view of what it is to be black. And one of them is and different points of view, different perspectives. So basically, one of the major tenets of postmodernist literature is the explosion of a gazillion different kinds of perspectives of what makes up the American experience. And so in Sunny's Blues, one character characterizes the black experience as just listening to the pure joy of jazz and blues, while the other one, that the black experience, is gaining your education through the Tuskegee similar to a Tuskegee Institute, and in order to climb the economic ladder of success. So you got two different versions of what it means to be a successful black person. Just in that one story, Ralph Ellison, in the first chapter from his novel Invisible Man, written in 1952, writes about the experience of attending a segregated school that keeps black Americans separate from white Americans. To Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, in their story, explore the hybrid nature of African American identity in itself, showing the tensions of that arise when one's identity is both American and black. So are you going to go with African values, or are you going to go with American values? And then, of course, you ask yourself, well, what exactly are American values? And so all of this asking of your cultural identity is also a characteristic of postmodernism. So this should be the end of it. The varied, playful, experimental literature of postmodernism, the critic Brian McHale helpfully observes in his book Constructing Modernism, presents readers not with many ways to know our one world, but instead with many knowable worlds created within many disparate works in many different ways. Modernist authors all strive to devise new techniques with which to accurately represent one world, whereas postmodernist authors, however, are no longer concerned with representing one world, but with creating many different worlds, many different literary worlds that represent a diversity of experiences. Thus, much as the American literature of the contemporary era presents us with a record of how the nation has known, questioned, and even redefined itself, so too does the literature of postmodernism present us with a record of how writers have known, questioned, and even redefined what is literature. So that's it for this particular on postmodernism. And if you have, this came out to an hour. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me.